Wow, that smells amazing.
Help yourselves, fellas.
Looks like we got here just in time.
Jed Coltrane was a hardened cattleman who believed a woman's worth was measured by the grit she carried in her calloused hands and the hearty meals she could slap on a tin plate. He had sent for a mail-order bride purely out of practical necessity, expecting a sturdy frontier woman who could mend fences and cook for a hungry ranch crew without complaint. When Clara stepped off the stagecoach in a neat lavender dress with soft hands and a gentle smile, Jed's heart sank with the instant conviction that he had made a terrible mistake. She looked far too delicate to survive the harsh prairie life, and Jed could already imagine his bunkhouse full of disappointed ranch hands grumbling over burned biscuits and watery stew. The first evening, as Clara tentatively explored the rustic cookhouse cluttered with cast-iron pans and dusty jars, Jed leaned against the doorframe with a skeptical smirk that stung her quiet pride. But when Clara set that very first supper before him, a golden flaky chicken pot pie that released a cloud of savory steam, Jed's mocking thoughts evaporated in a single, stunned, glorious bite. His eyes widened as tender chunks of meat and perfectly seasoned gravy melted across his tongue, and for a long moment he forgot how to speak in the presence of such unexpected magnificence. Clara merely smiled, her hands clasped nervously in front of her apron, as she confessed that her grandmother had once cooked for a governor's mansion back in Ohio and had taught her every cherished secret. Jed finished that entire pie by himself, scraping the plate with his fork, then leaned back and admitted with a sheepish grin that he might have judged her far too hastily the day before. The following morning, Clara rose before dawn to the sound of hungry cowboys dragging themselves toward the mess hall after a long night of guarding the herd against prowling coyotes and the chill wind. Instead of letting Jed surly cook, old Gus sling his usual gray porridge and scorched coffee, Clara gently took command of the stove with an authority that surprised even herself. She prepared towering stacks of fluffy sourdough pancakes, sizzling bacon cured in brown sugar, and scrambled eggs so light and creamy that the men fell silent after the very first mouthful. Word of the miraculous breakfast spread across the ranch like wildfire, and by noon every single ranch hand had invented some excuse to wander past the kitchen and steal a hopeful sniff of the simmering pots. Jed watched in amazement as Clara, barely breaking a sweat, ladled out rich beef stew and fresh buttermilk biscuits to a long, grateful line of sun-bronzed cowboys who licked their bowls clean. Even the grumpiest old trail boss, a leather-skinned man named Cletus, who distrusted all newcomers, declared that Clara's peach cobbler had saved his weary soul from complete and utter despair. Within a week, the ranch's reputation began to shift, as neighboring ranchers caught wind of the incredible meals being served at the Coltrane spread and started inviting themselves over for supper. Jed found himself swelling with a curious new pride, not just in the food but in the woman who hummed old hymns while kneading dough and never once complained about the blistering kitchen heat. Clara didn't just cook. She transformed mealtime into a sacred gathering where rough cowboys removed their hats, bowed their heads, and shared fellowship over platters piled high with love. One evening, after a particularly exhausting cattle drive that left every man caked in dust and too tired to speak, Clara produced a massive pot of chili Colorado that revived their spirits like campfire magic. Jed sat at the head of the long wooden table, watching his crew laugh and pass cornbread, and realized that Clara had done something he had never managed. She had made the ranch feel like a true home. He approached her later that night as she wiped down the counters, and with his hat in his hands, he stammered an apology so earnest that tears sparkled in the corners of Clara's gentle eyes. Clara placed a flour-dusted hand on his rough cheek and told him she had fallen in love with this wild land and with a stubborn cowboy who had finally learned to see with his heart rather than his doubts. From that night forward, Jed never once underestimated Clara's abilities, and he proudly told anyone who would listen that his bride could outcook any chef from St. Louis to San Francisco. Clara began to expand her culinary dominion beyond the ranch house, organizing community potlucks that drew settlers from miles around and transformed the once lonely prairie into a vibrant, connected family. She taught the younger cowhands how to make simple dishes for themselves, patiently guiding their clumsy fingers through the art of peeling potatoes and browning meat without setting the skillet ablaze. The Coltrane Ranch became famous not only for its prime beef, but for the welcoming table where no stranger was ever turned away and every plate was a promise of unconditional hospitality. Jed would often lean against the corral fence, watching Clara deliver a basket of fresh cinnamon rolls to the bunkhouse, and marvel at how his initial disappointment had been the universe's greatest hidden gift. One Sunday, the local preacher visited for dinner, and after tasting Clara's roasted hen with sage dressing, he jokingly suggested that her kitchen was the closest thing to a sanctuary in the entire territory. Clara blushed at the compliment, but firmly replied that she merely believed food carried the power to heal old wounds and soften the hardest hearts when prepared with genuine care and prayerful intention. As the months rolled into a golden autumn, Jed noticed that the ranch hands worked harder and grumbled less, their loyalty cemented by the knowledge that a spectacular meal always awaited their return. Clara started a small garden beside the cookhouse, filling it with herbs and vegetables that she dried and preserved, ensuring that even in the dead of winter, every stew burst with fresh, vibrant flavor. Jed would sometimes stand beside her in the garden, clumsily pulling weeds while she directed him with patient laughter. And those quiet afternoons became the most treasured hours of his entire life. One harsh winter, when a blizzard trapped a dozen traveling cowboys on their property, Clara orchestrated an impromptu feast from her pantry that turned a potential disaster into 3 days of cheerful warmth and storytelling. The stranded men, who had been half-frozen and hopeless when they arrived, later spread tailies across the territory of the angel in an apron who could conjure a banquet from beans and dried apples. Jed realized that Clara's cooking had not just filled bellies. It had built bridges between isolated families, tamed rivalries between neighboring ranchers, and placed the Coltrane name at the heart of the community. He began calling her Sugar, a nickname that stuck because everyone agreed. She was the sweetest thing to ever grace the Texas plains, and she wore the name like a badge of well-earned honor. Clara, in turn, grew to love her rugged husband's quiet strength and the way he always brought her fresh wildflowers after riding the fences, presenting them with dirt-stained hands and a boyish grin. Their love story became the kind of legend that old-timers recounted on front porches, a tale of how a man who judged a book by its cover was redeemed by a woman who wrote her worth in recipes. Every time a new mail-order bride arrived in the territory, nervous and uncertain, Clara would invite her into the kitchen, teach her a few simple dishes, and share the story of her own rocky but beautiful beginning. Jed, overhearing Clara encourage those young women with such empathy and grace, would silently thank the heavens for the day his shallow assumptions had been so thoroughly and deliciously overturned. The ranch thrived for decades, its long tables always crowded with children, grandchildren, and an ever-growing circle of friends who had all become family through the breaking of Clara's legendary sourdough bread. Even old Cletus, who eventually retired to a rocking chair on the porch, insisted that Clara's cooking had added 10 good years to his life, and he swore by her bone broth as the true elixir of the frontier. Jed often teased Clara that he had married her for her pot roast, but stayed for her kindness, a jest that always made her swat his arm and threaten to withhold his favorite pecan pie until he behaved. In the quiet twilight of their years, when the ranch was run by their capable sons, Clara would still rise early to bake biscuits simply because the scent of fresh bread meant home to everyone she loved. Jed, silver-haired and slower now, would sit at the kitchen table each morning, watching her work, the same magic she had performed on that very first day, his heart overflowing with the gratitude words could never capture. The entire county eventually chipped in to build a proper community cookhouse dedicated to Clara, where travelers and locals alike could share meals and remember the woman who had fed a whole ranch and united the wilderness. Clara's recipe box, dog-eared and stained with decades of love, became a treasured heirloom passed down through generations, each card carrying the memory of a meal that had nourished more than just the body. Jed, speaking at the dedication ceremony with a voice rough from emotion, told the gathered crowd that his wife had taught him the most profound truth of all: a woman's strength is not always loud, but sometimes simmers gently in a pot. The legacy of the Coltrane table lived on long after Clara and Jed were gone, a testament to the fact that the simplest acts of service can ripple through time and alter the destiny of an entire community. If this story of unexpected talents, humbled hearts, and frontier grace has touched you, then you already understand why tales like these deserve to be shared, remembered, and celebrated with every generation. Before you ride away from this campfire, we would be genuinely honored if you would press that like button, subscribe to Western Tales Official, and ring the bell so you never miss our next captivating story. We pour our hearts into bringing these Western narratives to life, and your support in the comments below truly fuels our passion for uncovering the hidden gems of frontier history and legend. Tell us what Clara's story stirred in your soul, perhaps a memory of a family recipe, a lesson in humility, or a quiet hope that love can indeed bloom in the most unexpected of circumstances. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that worth is never defined by first impressions, and that every person carries hidden gifts waiting for the right moment to nourish the world around them. Remember that the richest banquets are not measured by the silver on the table, but by the love poured into every dish. And sometimes, the greatest blessings arrive wearing lavender dresses and holding wooden spoons.